Okay, continuing on with measures of central tendency. The first one we covered was the mean. Um, another measure, another measure of central tendency is the median, or MD. The median is pretty easy to understand. The median is simply the middle score, the one that falls in the middle. The only trick to fully understanding the median is to know a couple of things. In order to find the median, you simply need to take your group of scores and line them up in order from lowest to highest or highest to lowest. It doesn't matter. If you have an odd number of scores, an odd number of data points, the median will be the actual middle score, the one that falls in the middle after you order your data from lowest to highest or highest to lowest. And if you have an even number of data points, the median will be the average of the two middle scores. So you would take the two middle scores, add them together, and divide by 2, and that's how you find your median. The advantage of the median is that it is not necessarily sensitive to outliers. It's been pointed out in the past that there are some circumstances, depending on how unusual your data set might be, that the median could be swayed widely by the addition or the subtraction of one particular case. But generally speaking, the median is regarded as not being sensitive to outlying scores the way the mean is, and so that has a tendency to make it more stable. It's pretty common in the United States, for example, to hear news reporters and economists talking about the median household income, not the mean household income, at least when it comes to the United States. And the reason for that is that one of the reasons we talk about measures of central tendency or measures of typicality is so we get a good idea of what reality is. Well, when you look at the mean income in the United States, it's pretty high. It's much higher than the median income. And so it makes more sense, it makes more intuitive sense if we're interested in knowing what the world is like, if we're talking about something like income, to refer to the median income as opposed to the mean income. The disadvantage the disadvantage of the median is that it does not use all the data. In fact, it only uses one or two data points. Remember, the median is really just one score if it falls right in the middle, or a combination of two scores if you have two scores that are in the middle. And as such, we don't have license. We can't use that number going forward into other procedures the way we can with the mean. The mode is also pretty easy to understand. The mode is simply the most frequently occurring score in a data set. Now, the mode, you can find the mode for a measure or for a group of quantitative data points, a group of ordinal level data points, as well as a group of nominal level data points. So the mode is really the only measure of central tendency that applies to nominal level data. The advantage is that it's pretty easy to find. It's also, as I just mentioned, a measure of typicality that can be communicated for nominal level data. The disadvantage is that there's not a whole lot we can do with it, kind of like the median, but even more so. The mode cannot be mathematically manipulated or used. When I say mathematically manipulated, I mean bringing it forward into other mathematical operations. Now, here's something that's interesting. In Chapter 2, you were introduced to the concept of skew. Except in Chapter 2, skew was discussed or talked about in terms of the shape of a distribution, whether a distribution is skewed to the right or skewed to the left, for example. Well, here's the neat thing about measures of central tendency, especially when it comes to the two of them that we just discussed, the mean and the median. If the mean is different or not equal to the median for a set of numbers, then you know that set of numbers has skew. If the mean and the median are exactly equal, that distribution does not have skew. So that's kind of a handy thing that you can use when determining or answering questions about skew. That's one of the first things I would that's one of the first things I would want to know is my mean equal to my median? If so, then that distribution of scores doesn't have any skew. If the mean is unequal to the median, then I know that distribution of scores has skew, and we can go from there. But we'll come back to skew in a little bit. Variability. Why do we talk about variability? We talk about measures of variability or measures of dispersion, and now I'm referring specifically to the range, the variance, and the standard deviation. We talk about measures of variability or measures of dispersion, and I use those terms interchangeably because sometimes it's not adequate to just use measures of central tendency to discuss a set of numbers if we really want to understand what that distribution looks like and learn other types of information about that set of numbers. So if we want to have full and complete understanding about a set of numbers, we need both measures of central tendency as well as measures of variability. Now, there are many measures of variability. We're going to deal primarily with three. The first one is referred to as the range, and the range is pretty easy to understand. The range is simply the distance between, or the difference between, the highest and the lowest score in your data set. That's it. And you'll see, if you haven't already, in a couple of the exercises that I put on this week's activities, that the range can be expressed either as a number, meaning that you take the highest score and subtract the lowest score and report the difference. Or you can also report the range as the lowest and highest score in brackets, which you'll see some examples of in some of the materials that I uploaded. So that's the range. And the range is very simple. It just gives us an overall measure of how spread out those scores are, assessed using simply the highest and the lowest score. In SPATs, you may have seen reference to, in Chapter 3, you may have seen reference to the interquartile range, or the IQR. The interquartile range is also fairly easy to understand. The interquartile range also is 2 scores, but those 2 scores are the 2 scores that fall at the 25th percentile and the 75th percentile. So in other words, they are the 2 scores that contain the middle 50%. Over here, lower 25%, higher 25%, in the middle 50%. We don't mess around too much with the IQR, and frankly, it's not a number that you'll see reported very often. The next measure of variability is the variance, and I've provided you with a few examples of how to calculate the variance. I'm also going to ask you to calculate the variance on your homework assignment, your first problem set this week. The variance is simply put, or simply as I can state it, is a measure of dispersion. It's a measure of how spread out a group of scores are as a whole. So in other words, if I gave you a set of numbers, whether it was 5 numbers, 10 numbers, 15 numbers, or it doesn't really matter. If I gave you a set of numbers and asked you to calculate the variance, that number, the variance, is simply how spread out those scores are, a measure of how spread out those scores are. Guess what? The standard deviation is also a measure of how spread out the scores are. It's a number that we can use. Both the standard deviation and the variance are numbers that we can use to describe how spread out a group of scores are. Why is it important to know how spread out a group of scores are? Because in order to understand distributions, and as you may recall, in SPATs, the word distributions is in the title. Basic statistics, tales of distributions. In order to understand distributions and why things vary, we first have to understand if they vary. How much variance, that's one of the measures we're talking about, how much variance a set of numbers has. So in sum, we are dealing with this week primarily, in addition to the graphic display of data, we're dealing with 3 measures of central tendency or typicality. And again, remember those words are being used interchangeably, central tendency and typicality. We're dealing with 3 measures of central tendency or typicality, and those are the mean, the median, and the mode. And we're also working with 3 measures of variability or dispersion. And those 3 measures of variability or dispersion are the range, the variance, and the standard deviation.